Good afternoon. My name is Chandra Ford, and I'm on faculty in the School of Public Health, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today and to introduce Dr. Courtney Cogburn. Dr. Cogburn is an associate professor who employs a transdisciplinary approach to examine the role of racism in the production of racial inequalities in health. She's on the faculty at the Columbia University Population Research Center and a faculty affiliate of the Center on African American Politics and Society and the Data Science Institute. Her work is funded by the NIH, Bldg Johnson Foundation, and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation at the Columbia School of Journalism. Prior to joining Columbia, Dr. Cogburn was a Bldg Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. She holds a BA in Psychology from the University of Virginia, an MSW from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and a PhD in the combined program in Education and Psychology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Cogburn is also a board member of the International Center of Applicants Against Discrimination. She has a ton of really interesting projects going on, and so I'm actually going to step out of the way and let you go ahead and
Thank you, Dr. Ford. Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm delighted to be here today. Let's see if I can get this work outside the podium, to talk about some of the work that I'm doing and look forward to the conversation. And as I said in the description for the talk, what I've opted to do is to give you sort of a general overview of multiple projects that I hope will foster a rich conversation once I'm finished, but I'm happy to go into more detail about any of the projects that we're working on if you're interested. So I think a key question to my work is trying to unpack why race matters for health, moving beyond using race as a variable and starting to think about what is it about race that is contributing to some of the patterns that we observe in population health. And I just wanted to give you an overview of what some of the conceptual empirical work that grounds what I do. So one is the belief that racism is a fundamental cause of these inequalities. And also that race in and of itself doesn't cause or influence anything. It is a category, it's a box that people check, but the part of my work is sort of interested in what comes along with checking that box that we need to understand that helps us understand these patterns. Also that effectively addressing racial inequities in health requires that we evaluate and address the cultural conditions that produce those differences. So it's part of what comes along with that box. And also that cultural processes and systems are important but under-examined in the empirical health literature. And that mass media is an important cultural tool with significant implications for health, including stress, behavior, practice, policy, and ideologies. So each of these kinds of represents the broad empirical and conceptual literature that informs my work and why I do what I do. Also, this notion that the struggle against oppression and exploitation is most powerfully resisted and maintained on cultural terrain. So I am interested in cultural systems, cultural processes in relation to health, and specifically grounded in race and racism. So what I've decided to do is to give you an overview of a conceptual paper that was recently published that tries to bring some of these ideas together. I found that in trying to unpack what I mean by culture and cultural systems, et cetera, that I've had to extend my reach beyond my home disciplines to think about how other people have talked about culture and cultural processes. And in this paper, sort of my initial attempt to kind of integrate that and bring it together under a health framework to think about how we could use that understanding to help guide some of our work. And then I'll give you some empirical examples of the ways in which I'm trying to apply that conceptual model in my empirical work. So the first piece is around culture, race, and health and implications for racial inequities and population health. And really this paper is making an argument that we've had this increased discourse around culture. Healthy People 2020 argues that there's an aggregate of social and cultural institutions, norms, patterns, beliefs, and processes, excuse the typo, that influence the life of an individual or community. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is really pushing this idea of a culture of health and reference shared national priority for health for all, which includes creating healthier, more equitable communities. And what I argue is that I think this is important. This is an important shift, right, to really start to unpack social determinants of health, social conditions, particularly pointing to questions of culture. But what I found that in this work, we kind of stop there at naming culture, but don't really unpack what that means or how we measure that or how it actually shows up in people's lives. And so I think culture has been under-conceptualized. It's been narrowly framed in terms of cultural threat. And studying race without racism in these bodies of research and conceptual work, and really failing to integrate existing conceptual methodological policy and practice recommendations for people who have been thinking about culture, race, and racism for a very long time. And so if population health is moving in this direction of thoughtfully considering the social conditions related to health, making an argument that we need to pull from a very broad and substantial existing literature that has been thinking about the nuances of these issues for quite some time. Also, it shows up in our references of systemic racism and structural racism. So even among people who have been talking and thinking about racism in relation to health for a very long time have been referencing culture in various ways. So it's been talked about as something that underlies or reinforces structures and institutions, our social ideologies and customs. It's been talked about in terms of systems of social and cultural phenomena that promote white supremacy, such as in the form of media portrayals. It's also been talked about as a form of social toxicity, so just exposure to these sorts of things as a source of psychosocial stress and the implications for biological and psychological systems. And so this work has been naming culture in the context of racism for a while as well. What I find in this literature, however, is that there's a dominant emphasis on individual experiences when it comes to measuring racism. So we tend to focus on direct encounters with racial discrimination. It's much more difficult to think about how to measure these broader kind of atmospheric type of manifestations of racism, even if we name it in the conceptual literature. So there's a disconnect between how racism is being conceptualized historically and then how it actually shows up in the empirical literature. And then there's also limited explicit grounding in cultural frameworks. So again, drawing from other disciplines that have thought very carefully about what culture is, what cultural systems are, and really integrating that into frameworks around racism. So culture racism, drawing from Powell, is defined as societal beliefs and customs that promote the assumption that the products of white culture, such as language, traditions, appearance, values, etc., are superior to those of non-white cultures. And in this paper, I draw from a model from Hall and Lamont, who are thinking about social inequality much more broadly. They're not thinking about race specifically, but they forward this model for categorizing cultural phenomena. And so in the paper, I try to use that framework, grounded in discussions of racism, as a way to help organize existing literature and the ways in which we've been talking about culture kind of generically, and give it a little more structure. So in the Hall and Lamont paper, they describe symbolic boundaries. So proximity to center or margins of a community. I would describe racial frames and ideology, stereotype threat, stigma, aggregated bias as falling under this category. They also reference status hierarchies, so the implicit principles determining social status and prestige. This might show up in our institutional policies, practices, and norms. And collective imaginaries, which are referencing representations of symbols that exist in symbols, myths, and narratives. Again, kind of thinking about racialized symbols, imagery, and language. So I took each of these categories as a framework and then tried to organize the existing literature to think about people who aren't explicitly defining what culture is, but are tapping into these elements to try and create a more integrated frame for work that falls under these categorizations. So I'll just quickly give you a couple of examples from each of these categories. So symbolic boundaries are the ways in which we rationalize racial patterns, the racial frames that we use. This has been talked about in terms of the interpretive tools that we use to explain and justify racial inequities, the curation of whiteness and otherness through racial ideologies that guide meaning-making, action, attitudes, and behaviors. Also the tendency in health work to locate the problem of disease in the bodies of oppressed peoples and the behaviors of oppressed peoples, rather than grappling with structures and systems and how they're implicated in the patterns that we're observing in those groups. And in fact, explicitly calling out that practice as racist. So calling out the practice of relying on race as a variable without unpacking what that actually means, as a bio-racist frame, and sort of inherently sort of adding value to race as opposed to the conditions that produce race and racial differences. And Metzel and colleagues also talk about this in terms of the tendency to emphasize cultural competence. We need to understand different groups and their practices and beliefs as opposed to structural competence. We also need to understand the way systems and policies, et cetera, produce barriers that have implications for health. And again, the patterns that we're observing by race at the population health level. So status hierarchies, which reference the implicit principles determining social status, shows up in a couple of ways, a couple of examples that I want to share. So Harrell describes this, I would put this under this category, socio-political context. So the nature of political debate and public discussion about race, racial ideology, policies, and practices within institutions. How do we discuss racial disparities, for instance, in health? How do we frame that as a racial problem or don't racialize it at all beyond including race as a variable in our models? Bldg, which applies the white racial frame to medicine and public health, thinks about the ways in which white superiority seeps into our practices and values. So thinking about freeing people of color from their destructive health habits, converting people overseas to better Western folkways, and centering whites as a reference group when establishing norms for health. So all of this would fall under this categorization of cultural racism and the practice of cultural racism in public health and medicine. It also shows up in terms of our collective imaginary. So the implicit principles, I think this is switched, but this is sort of symbols and language. Some people in sociology refer to this as dog whistles, for instance, or the use of coded language to elicit negative racial sentiment. I like this example from Paul Ryan, where he's quoted as blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. In the same interview, which is the use of racially coded language without referencing race or racial group at all. In the same interview, Paul Ryan cites the work of Charles Murray, who's made the argument that blacks are genetically inferior. Paul Ryan doesn't say blacks are genetically inferior. He cites the work of someone who did in the context of blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. So it becomes this kind of complex web of language and symbolism that becomes, kind of falls under this basket, right, of cultural racism. People in media and communication studies, which is one body of work that I had to draw on heavily in this paper, thinking about the way in which we treat whites and blacks in the media. I'm thinking about the gentle hands with which we treat white mass murderers and treating them to Burger King and questioning their childhood and upbringing and their mental health state versus the way that we treat others in the media, blaming those who have been the victims of police violence and blaming them for their own deaths, what they should or should not have done, what they should or should not have been obese and maybe they wouldn't have died in a chokehold, the ways in which we frame and talk about these issues, right? And even the way we talk about and frame issues of health. So I just pulled this actually this morning. Being black is still bad for your health. Just that framing of the problem of health blames the health problem on blackness, as opposed to black people living in white supremacist, racially oppressive systems that affect their health. And so this language that we use to frame these issues become critical and become a part of the cultural landscape. I also wanted to use this example from a textbook from an elementary school. It's the ways in which we sort of think about historical framings and narratives. So this says when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. So the ways in which we whitewash and frame historical moments also become a part of this cultural landscape that I'm trying to tap into.
Could you go back now to the previous slide?
Mm-hmm.
And let me quibble with you a little bit,
okay.
or you tell me you're going to cover all this and later. I don't see the phrase being black is still bad for your health as blaming blacks. It seems to me that phrase is a descriptive phrase that I sometimes use the phrase EWB, existing while black, or the term EWB, existing while black, which is that black people are confronted by whites in ways that are completely discriminatory, which means that being black is bad for your health and well-being. I don't see, so please explain why that is blaming blackness as opposed to blaming white racists.
Do you see white racist name in this, or white racism?
I don't see why you need to name it. It's
Why not?
Because
Why not name
condition-
that instead of blackness? What would be the value of naming white racism in this sentence as opposed to naming black in this sentence? Or even in your phrase of using existing while black names the existence of being black, which suggests that there's something about existing, not just being black. Being just suggests that you are black, you've checked the box of being black. Existence even offers some other context around blackness. And even your comment around white racism, so why name being black as opposed to white racism? Or what would be different?
What phrase would you use as opposed to being black is still bad for your health?
Racism is still bad for your health. Anti-black racism is still bad for your health. White racism is still bad for your health.
It's still bad for the health of blacks.
Sure. So we continue to rely on these because
I'm sorry, but okay, you go ahead, because I simply don't, I mean.
there are ways in which we use this language where there's these implications that sort of subtly imply that we understand, of course, that racism is part of this, right? Or we've modeled race and differences between blacks and whites, and we understand, of course, that racism is a part of what's at play here, even if we fail to explicitly name it. We consistently fail to explicitly name anti-black racism, hold whiteness accountable in our discussions of health around black people. And when we consistently do that, we start to create a narrative, whether we intended to or not, that doesn't implicate those systems very explicitly. So what happens in this literature is that you have some people who explicitly engage and name these systems, and others who just suggest that we understand that that's there and that's part of it. And I would argue, as a cultural system, as narratives that we produce, the discourses that we produce around these issues, it's problematic to leave that invisible and to not name it explicitly. But I'll keep going. So some of the key points that I want to pull out of this are cultural systems, such as cultural racism, undergird the social conditions and institutions that shape racial inequalities in health. And to understand the relationship between culture and health, we must draw upon broad multidisciplinary literature that already examine culture, cultural systems, and cultural threat to help us put more meat to what this means and how we might begin to think about more deeply conceptualizing, and certainly how we might measure what some of these things are in terms of their effects on health. And certainly I would argue that we need to broaden our scope of what culture is and what cultural racism is. It's not just media portrayals, which is the way that even in the racism literature, when cultural racism gets talked about, it's primarily thought of in terms of media representations. And what I try to represent is that it's a much broader cultural landscape that we're talking about that sort of extends beyond media portrayals. And that policies targeting racial health equity would benefit from integrating more explicitly social theory and meaning assessment of what the racial context is around the racial patterns that we're observing around race. So I want to give you a couple of empirical examples of how I'm attempting to explore how do we measure this. And I'm kind of in the Wild West a little bit, right? I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure it out. Using this conceptual grounding, how might I measure cultural racism and what that is? So in one project, which is an experimental study, I'm thinking about the effects of media-based racism on acute physiological, emotional, and behavioral stress responses. And so I'm thinking about exposure to media content, and while people consume that content, what types of stress responses are emerging as they consume that content. So this is a sort of representation of the broader model, but again, I'm thinking about cultural racism, thinking about media-based racism as a specific form of cultural racism exposure, and I'm looking at stress reactivity in these three different ways. And so this is the first paper that's coming out of this work that's under revision now. So we try to represent this in the form of a blog. So we had people randomly assigned to a blatant race condition where someone's in blackface or using the N-word, versus more subtle conditions where, like Paul Ryan blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. And we pre-tested kind of what fell into extremes of blatant versus subtle and used that to populate the blogs. I'm happy to talk about the methodology in more detail. Sample of blacks and whites, 18 to 25-year-olds. And generally what we were finding at the physiological level, particularly in terms of heart rate variability, we found that in the blatant condition, blacks actually demonstrated an adaptive physiological response. They modulated their heart rate just fine. They had a reaction while they were viewing the content. They returned to baseline once that content was gone. That's considered a healthy stress response at the physiological level. When they were exposed to subtle content, however, they had this sort of blunted pattern of heart rate variability. So it was sort of this flat line. We didn't see a lot of change, which is generally associated with effortful coping, and certainly not something you want to see when people are being exposed to a stressor. At the emotional level, we saw increased hostility as well as interest among Blacks when they were exposed to either of the blatant or subtle condition. And also, interestingly, in the blatant and subtle conditions, we had a behavioral task, not a task, they didn't know it was a task. We gave them a bowl of M&Ms that they snacked on through this is just a snack that's part of the study. We actually weighed the bowl before and after, and then measured the change. And what we found, contrary to what we predicted, was that Blacks actually ate less when in the racial conditions, either the blatant or subtle, than when in the neutral condition. I thought that there would be more stress eating, more eating of M&Ms, and that's not what we found. And I'm not a health behavioral scholar, I'm not an emotional eating scholar, and so when I dug into that literature more deeply, I started to understand how complex emotions are. It's not just negative and positive feelings. Guilt is very different than sadness, than anger, and all of that might elicit different kinds of reactions. And so certainly when I went back to the literature, I started to understand the complexities of this a little bit more. What we observed for whites was almost the exact opposite. So whites in the blatant condition had that kind of dysregulated heart rate variability. They weren't modulating their heart rate very well in that condition. In the subtle condition, they just weren't really reacting. So they were sort of registering it as low distress or not really engaged at all. In the emotional responses, we saw that whites in both the racial conditions reported more guilt and less enthusiasm. And in the behavioral, with the behavioral outcome, we didn't see a difference in their snacking across any of the conditions. So there's that study. Then this study kind of led me to think about, okay, we're measuring these acute stress responses in, a 6-minute block of time in a laboratory. If I'm interested in health, I need to know how often this type of exposure actually comes up in the media. How chronic is the exposure to this type of content? So started to think about data science approaches and how they might help me assess the prevalence of media-based racism in associations with population health. I naively went into this thinking I was going to assess media-based racism, which is just not possible. So we ended up narrowing this down to focus specifically on racial violence in the national media and social media, specifically around police violence. So we've started creating this massive data set of national national coverage of police violence from 2006 to 2018. This is the pattern of frequency that's changed in that 12-year period. We've also started thinking about using Twitter data, so we're starting to document how people are engaging around particular deaths that have been prominent in the media. This is data from Trayvon Martin, so we're trying to figure out where these spikes are happening. And we see one around the death of Trayvon, we see another around the acquittal of Zimmerman. And part of what we're interested in is sort of linking both that national media and the social media data to health in meaningful ways. So for the Twitter data, for instance, we're interested in what we're trying to figure out how to do now is sentiment analysis around these peaks. And breaking down Twitter networks to see if certain networks in Twitter are using certain kinds of language related to stress and health. I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I'm so angry, etc., in relation to these particular peaks, and if there's increases during those periods as opposed to the in-between points. And then we also are able to glean to some degree where the activity is happening by city. And so for people who are in cities with actual events that have happened that have been very prominent in the media, are we seeing different types of responses in those clusters as opposed to people who are more distal from the death of Trayvon, the death of Eric Garner, et cetera. So some of the ways that we're interested in thinking about this is, so I talked about different types of stress responses that might emerge in social media data, but we're also interested in whether, and this is, as you can imagine, this is very tricky to model in a meaningful way, but do these patterns, that this spike that happens around 2014 meaningfully relate to various health elements? Yes?
What is heat degree? It was on the previous slide.
It's activity by city. So how hot, how active is the topic by city?
Like number of tweets or retweets, something.
Yeah. And then the final project that I want to give you an overview is thinking about, this hasn't been directly connected to health yet, but really trying to think about the ways in which people engage issues of racism. And do they really understand what racism is? And might we use emerging technologies to help them think about racism in a deeper, more meaningful way, and certainly try to think about ways to shift engagement around racism. So this is really kind of drawing from this belief that achieving racial justice requires that we understand racism, and not an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption or production of silence, although that's certainly important, but rather a visceral understanding that connects the spirit and body as much as reason. And so I wanted to create an experience that would help people really kind of produce this gut punch, this visceral experience of racism that might kind of connect us in a more meaningful way to these issues. So this is a project that I developed in collaboration with Jeremy Valenson at Stanford University. He's been working in virtual reality for over 20 years, thinking about social and behavioral applications of VR, virtual reality. He's been interested in working around issues of race and racism. That's not really his lane, that's not what he does. So when I reached out to him to work on this project, he was very excited to work together. So we got the funding to pull off this project. I want to emphasize, and I'll describe it in just a second, but I want to emphasize that what we created was very, again, transdisciplinary in what we wanted to make. It wasn't just sort of interdisciplinary and that I went to consult with someone to ask them about what to do. All these people were at the same table trying to imagine what this is and what we were going to create together, which is very different and much more integrated. And so really drew from these multiple disciplines in trying to do that. And in this work, people ask me, so the target for this particular work was a white liberal audience. And when I say that, people are sometimes surprised and say, aren't you preaching to the choir? And so then I started putting a choir in my talk because I'm absolutely talking to the white liberal choir. And what I mean by that is this is a group of people who espouse beliefs of justice and equity, but their behavior engagement may be inconsistent with those beliefs. Or they may have stopped at being identified as liberal and not sort of deepening their engagement and understanding of what that means in real life. So they were the target audience for this particular project. This is hard to see. How many people have done any type of virtual reality before? Okay, just a few people. So there's sort of two big buckets of virtual reality. There's the virtual reality that you can sort of watch on your phone, your 360 video. We could record this room, and then you could have a video and watch it on your phone, and it could feel like you're sitting or part of the crowd that's in this room. This piece was a digital immersive experience and interactive, which means that you are in a digital environment, you become an avatar that you're able to control the movements of. I'll show you a video of that in just a second. So in the piece, what we decided to do was have you become a black male named Michael Sterling as a child, an adolescent, and as an adult, experiencing racism in different forms, in different contexts at each of these ages. So as a child, you're sitting on the floor. As the user in the headset, you're playing with blocks. You can grab these blocks, you can stack them, you can throw them. The kids in the scene are saying things like, Mike, throw the fireball, throw the scary black fireball. Black is always the scariest color. So we're trying to represent the ways in which these racial narratives actually show up at a very young age. We goad you into actually throwing the block. 98% of people do. They usually throw it at that kid that said scary black fireball. When you do that, it triggers, because it's an interactive experience, so when you throw that block, it triggers a white female teacher video that says, Michael, you're being dangerous, you're gonna hurt someone, even though the other kids are engaged in the same behavior. Again, my background's in education and psychology, so we drew from a broad literature that documents the differences by race in disciplinary practices in the classroom, even when you're engaged in the exact same behavior, and then use that to try and represent this age period in the piece. In the second scene, you're in your bedroom in Brooklyn. You can walk around the room, you can throw this basketball, you can look and interact with objects in the room. There's an alert that pops up on your computer screen that says, an unarmed black teen has been shot by a white police officer. Again, we're trying to capture things that are not only happening directly to you, but the ways in which it's atmospheric and it's around you. You get a phone call, you pick up the cell phone, it's your white friend Adam telling you that he's there and it's time to go to your basketball game. In the scene, you go down stairs, your mother is watching the news and says, Michael, you need to change. The police are looking for someone who's dressed very similarly to you. Adam gets indignant, sort of, and says, come on, we're running late, it's not a big deal. Your mother then says, don't forget what happened to your brother. You then grab the hoodie that's on the chair, you hear it zip, you put it on, and then go outside. So in that, we're trying to represent, again, not just the threat of something happening with the police, but that a mother has to worry and consider the t-shirt you're wearing when you leave the house, and that this something with the police has happened in this family before, although we don't explain that or unpack that for you in any way. And the ways in which this white friend, Adam, is a little bit clueless about the significance of what the mother's trying to represent. So there's sort of layers that we were trying to capture in the piece. After the middle scene, you go to the street, you're talking to neighbors who are wishing you good luck for the basketball game, and suddenly a police car pulls up, 3 officers jump out and yell at you to get down on your knees and put your hands up. That it means you, the user, get down on your knees and have your hands in the air if you follow the instructions. There's a moment in this where the lights go out and the sound goes off, and you just hear your mother's voice saying, just do what you have to do to get home alive. Again, speaking to the talk, the narrative that many black youth receive from their parents. And what does it feel like when you're the one receiving that talk in a moment where we're suggesting by that talk that you need to minimize your own emotions for the sake of your own survival. With the technology, you're also able to track behavior within the headset. So you can track where people look, if you actually got down on your knees and put your hands up, if you made direct eye contact with the police officers. The police officers actually become more aggressive if you make direct eye contact versus if you look down at the ground. So there's ways in which you can create interactivity within the piece that's actually pretty important. We also use, I'm sorry you can't see this image, you'll see it more clearly in the next couple of slides, but we use mirrors a lot, so we want you to see the body that you're in. As you transition from each age, you see yourself transition into this older version of yourself. In the last scene, you're applying for a job, and I'll just kind of shortcut this. You're kind of dismissed and ignored in various ways and assumed not to be the candidate from the most competitive university that's referenced in the piece. The white candidate is assumed to be that person. And when you're corrected, you say, I'm just going to take him back first. You don't mind. You later get a voicemail saying that while you're an excellent candidate, you're not just a good cultural fit for the company. And whenever I say that, and when people say that, then inevitably, especially if they haven't gone through the VR and they've just heard me describe it, inevitably someone says, that would never happen. Someone wouldn't say that. And then the black people in the room raise their hands. It was absolutely what happened. And I think what I found to be interesting about this piece is that it seems to spark different and probably more honest conversations than I've seen happen without it. In the ways in which white colleagues have to start grappling with the experience of their black colleagues that they haven't really tapped into in a very meaningful way. So this gives you a sense of how this body transfer component, being able to see your body in the mirror, being able to move your arms up and down. Are you all able to see that? And how synchronous it is with your own movement. So you have hand controllers, you're also wearing a headset. The interactivity is also an important piece. So again, being able to get down on your knees and put your hands up, sitting on the floor, playing with blocks are all an important part of feeling like you're using this body in some way and are connected to this body in some way. And there's a lot to actually unpack there because the virtual reality literature kind of talks about this as you feel like you're becoming another person. I don't actually think that's what's happening in this piece, but I'm happy to unpack that. And we premiered this work at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018, and we put together this trailer, so I thought I would show it to you since you can't do the actual VR.
Just brush it off.
You have now become Mike Sterling. Look at yourself in the mirror.
So with the 1,000-cut journey, what we're trying to represent is not just the police yelling at you, but the thousands of ways in which you are, you can turn the lights back on. You can turn the lights back on. Thank you so much. the thousands of ways in which you are encountering racism in various forms, and how those can be very difficult to describe to people, can be very difficult to understand if you haven't experienced them yourself. So when we were at the film festival, we had a white-walled space and allowed people to use markers to write on the wall when they came out of the headset. So people saying things like, you think you know how something feels until you experience it, eye-opening, we have such a long way to go. Someone came back later and wrote, can't stop thinking about this project, harrowing, powerful, out-of-body experience. Truly eye-opening. So at least anecdotally, we were starting to get a sense of how people were feeling and reacting coming out of this piece. And we've since run thousands of people in various contexts that have helped inform our understanding of this. We've also run a series of studies to try to get empirical data around what's happening to people. And this has been tricky for me because even as I try to carefully design these 3 different studies, I still don't feel like we're actually measuring what's happening for people, but hopefully we get some sense of what's going on. So what we tried to do was get a baseline measure of things like empathy, implicit racial bias, beliefs about justice in society, for instance. Then we had people, before they knew the project had anything to do with race, they just knew it was a virtual reality project. They then come into the lab about 2 weeks later, go through the VR or control condition. We measure those same things again, and then we follow up 3 weeks later, measuring those things again. Something that we tried to include in the 2 of the studies was at an attempt to kind of capture the shift in how people analyze racial problems, which is much harder to measure than, say, empathy and implicit bias, is we gave people vignettes. We gave them a vignette that happened to be around structural racism in maternal health. We didn't name racism, right? You know that the person in the vignette is a Black woman. And then we analyze how their assessment of what's happening in that vignette might change over time. If they were in the VR condition versus the control condition, are they more likely to start naming race and racism more explicitly? And we're analyzing that data, and all of this data actually right now. So I don't have any results to share, unfortunately. We're also working with different institutions to explore ways that we might integrate this in meaningful ways with curriculum. So part of what we think is most valuable about the VR is not that it's a magic pill you put on this headset and suddenly you understand and you get it, but that the conversations are different and the engagement might be different after you come out of the VR. So we've integrated this into a course at the Columbia School of Social Work. It's a required course around power, racism, oppression, and privilege that our first-year master's students have to take. Half of the class does the VR, half of the class only takes the class. We're trying to assess changes in their journal entries, their performance in a client interaction where they're supposed to apply an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens to their client engagement at the end. And then we're also doing work with the University of Michigan to integrate it into parts of their curriculum as well. This is completely exploratory, right? We're just trying to figure out, are there meaningful ways to integrate this kind of technology, these kinds of experiences with meaningful discourse and dialogue with a skilled facilitator that might be particularly beneficial. We're also, I was actually just in LA a few weeks ago shooting another piece, a new VR piece, and this time we're using motion capture. These are the actors who are in the second scene. And motion capture allows us, so in the first piece, everyone are video billboards, and you can only have so many of those running at a time in the experience. This will actually make everyone digital avatars, but basing their movements on actual actors who went through the scene, who got recorded in these suits, which gives us more flexibility in terms of how we build out interactions in the piece. This piece will also include voice interactivity, where what you say, not just what you do, actually changes what happens in the scene. And another important piece of this that's been really fascinating to me, because again, I've been talking about understanding structures and systems. So we're also playing around with how to introduce data more explicitly into the experience. So what we're playing around with now is that you'll be able to go back to a scene and then interact with data points within that scene. So for instance, we're trying to figure out how to allow you to drag a scene backwards in time or forwards in time and see how different policies actually reshape the physical landscape and the people in that environment. We're also playing around with how to use zip codes as an indicator of your life expectancy, your et cetera, right? The ways in which zip codes are predictive of so many life outcomes and have people interact with that as a data point, as well with the multiple bodies that are in the space. But all of that's complicated, and we're trying to figure out the best way to achieve it. But the idea is, can we use an immersive virtual reality experience to help people understand systems and systemic racism, not just the emotional experience of having these things happen directly to you. So that's it, and plenty to talk about, and I look forward to the discussion. Yes.
So I'm curious, you were talking about how the VR was kind of geared towards like a liberal white audience, and a lot of the places that you may have tested it may have attracted those crowds at the Tribeca Film Festival. I'm curious what you, so at that point I would think that there's at least some belief or buy-in into what you're producing, right? Like you can at least believe that racism exists.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you would think if you took it down, you know, somewhere else, a place where they might not even believe or recognize that those experiences exist, and how that might, how the VR experience might be different, or what you'd expect.
Yeah, so I wouldn't do it. Stress. And I didn't design it for that audience, but given what we did, and I think I might create something different for that particular audience. If they were willing to put on this headset, which is questionable, I think they would probably continue to resist that narrative and find alternative explanations for what's happening and what's going on. And that just wasn't a box that I wanted to try and unpack. I wanted to try and deepen engagement among people who think they already understand and get this, and try to push them more deeply. And also thinking about that audience as when you have these conversations around race and racism, that is an audience that's most likely to believe they already get it. And so you're not talking to them, and you're talking to the other ones. I'm a good person, you know, I'm a liberal person, so you're not talking about me, you're talking about the bad apples over there. And so what kind of piece could I create that would implicate that group as much as anyone else in the experiences that we were trying to represent and talk about?
So I'm thinking about the whole process, and you can imagine, I mean, so this is actually an interesting group because some of us are public health people and some of us are social science people who think about the kind of role of social and economic systems in creating racism and structural racism and so forth. So it's an interesting group to bring together. So I'm thinking about the role of social class in all of this, because clearly people, Black people and other people of different social classes also have quite different experiences. I mean, the specifics of their experience in the world, their experience of racism in the world can be quite different. That doesn't mean that upper class, for example, Black people have experience less discrimination. It just may come in somewhat of a different form. And there's also heterogeneity among people with what they experience. But I'm specifically thinking of class. And I wonder if you thought at all about bringing that in. I mean, it's a whole other dimension to bring in, which is complicated because you've got a lot of dimensions going already. But, in some ways, you kind of want people to see other people who share characteristics with them, but have have a particular difference, which is race. But, that this is not a problem which is associated with people in particular social classes. This is a pervasive problem. So, you see what I'm saying? I'm thinking about intersectionality of race and social class, and whether there's a way to bring that element into what you're doing.
So, I think there's an assumption that we did it. And we did. We thought very carefully about social class and how we wanted to represent it in this experience. And again, considering the audience that we were talking about, we wanted to treat class as not neutral, because you can't neutralize it, but we didn't want to have it be and say a lower resource community where people will feel like the police are being so vigilant because there's probably a lot of crime and that's why they're being so aggressive. So we wanted you to think about race explicitly, and that required us to think about the intersection of social class. And I think, thinking about racism as a fundamental cause of health inequities and the ways in which racism predicts differences in social class and also has this direct relationship, and also the ways in which we see these interesting patterns of health inequities at higher levels of education and income. We have a sense that your education and income doesn't buy you what you think it does, and not that you explicitly said that you don't think it's less, that you think it's different. But I also think it actually shows up in some very consistent ways in spite of your education and income. And so, for instance, when I've been doing this work, talking about this work in law firms, for instance, and I have a senior black partner saying he's been stopped by the police wearing a $3,000 suit, who were very aggressive with him as well, to the shock of his white colleagues who would think you're a senior partner in one of the top law firms in the country, and that's still happening to you. So there are certainly some ways in which it's different. It manifests in very different ways. We were just having a conversation earlier about the spaces in which you work also cause it to manifest. Like the ways in which racism manifests in a white academic space is very different than the ways it might manifest in a law firm, for instance. So all of that matters. But we certainly try to think about social class in a way that we wanted people to focus on race. And that required us to think
No, I
about
think that's great,
intersection.
and I think you have, from the little of your work I saw, you have focused on it, but I was thinking about, and I don't mean that like drivers have different experiences based on socioeconomic space. I agree. It's more that the different settings you live in may create different manifestations. It's more that a law firm is different from an academic setting. Or that, on the job, if you're a pipe fitter, may be different than, if you're in an academic setting, something like that. And, in some ways, so I'm not talking about the content, I'm talking more about the situation you portray.
So I would say that aside from the workplace situation, which is in a higher end work environment, that in the black audiences that we've engaged around this work, all of them identify with all pieces of this, even if it might be in a, so I think we tried to hit a more universal space, and certainly you could imagine all the ways in which you would vary and change the elements of it, but we tried to be pretty broad in what we represented.
So I really like that you're focusing, you're kind of hyper-focusing on the white liberal audience, because I think, especially in a place like California where we have this belief that, we are progressive here. But I wonder, do you have plans to follow people who engage in virtual reality and kind of follow what policies they support and things like that? Because I think, deepening the conversation is obviously important, but I wonder for those who experience virtual reality, do they then start to change the way that they view policies that actually have disproportionate, negative impacts on black people?
Yeah, so we try to get them in some ways with the 3-week follow-up, but it's hard to get people to come back. Of course, we have attrition at that point. We have a mobile study where we track data inside the headset, and people got assigned to answer a race-related policy question either right before they went through the VR or after they went through the VR. That was kind of our way of creating the two conditions. And we asked them whether they're willing to pay a higher fee to attend this event in order to support the inclusion of blah, 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 blah. But I don't know what's happening with that data yet. So we're trying to get at that. We're also, part of why we're interested in doing this within classrooms and within organizations is that you have people for a longer period of time, and it's easier to track them and keep them in one place. So it's definitely on our radar because that's what we're interested in. Like, are you acting differently?
Right.
And the way that I talk is like, in terms of empathy, you can feel bad all day. Your feelings don't do anything for the public good. Are you acting differently? Are you thinking differently? Are you processing and analyzing problems differently? And that's much messier to try and measure, and something you would expect to happen over a period of time, and it gets harder to track people. So we're trying to figure out ways to tap into that potential shift that might be happening.
Have you considered the intersection of race and gender? Because I feel like, especially in the media, how black women or black men are portrayed is very different. Like with police brutality, for example, it's almost exclusively about black men. They're either super sexualized or portrayed as extremely violent. So I was wondering if you had looked at, language in the media and health effects on black women and men, and whether that differs or not.
Yeah, so as a Black woman, I've definitely thought about the intersection of race and being a woman. Gender is also here. We're representing the experience of a Black male. So in the ways in which I would argue that social class is here, so is gender in these multiple intersections. And part of why we would focus on this particular intersections is because we understand that it's a very different experience potentially. We couldn't just replace that avatar as a Black woman and expect the exact same things to happen. So yes, we thought about it and are aware of it and made a specific choice to focus on the Black male experience.
I really like your kind of the framework of culture related to the lacism and the health. Just I want to add in one more dimensions about the culture. Is one of the function of culture, I think, as it provides some of the resources or tools to interpret the specific situations. So if some person's experience of situations, and then that person tried to interpret the situation, what is meant by the situations, right? And then at that moment, actually, people recall or some kind of mobilize some resources about, and then those resources actually comes from the set of cultural tools or schemas or something like that. So my kind of, I wonder whether you have a plan to ask the participant of that, the virtual reality experiment, to ask them kind of their initial reaction about the first scene. So when they saw the balls on their hand, and then the light screen, they say, breaking news is there. So that's from the first moment. Maybe some people thought that it is a normal situation, but the other people maybe, their eyes kept by that monitors, breaking news is. And then after that, the second sequence is, got a call from mom, and then mom talked about some things. And then some people try to interpret in a certain way, the other people interpret the other. Yeah. So those kind of the interpretation way is very interesting to think about. Yeah. What is the culture, racism, and how are they together?
Yeah, we've only done that informally in the conversation that we've had with people where people will say, this experience jumped out to me the most for these reasons, or this one or that one, and would reference their own experiences and their own cultural lens in some ways and how they were interpreting the things, but we haven't done that in a formal way. But we were very interested in, and I'm still trying to figure out how to unpack this empirically, is that we thought that it mattered for you to start off as a child and not start off as an adolescent. We picked an age at which Black boys are known to be adultized and treated as being older than they actually are. And we wanted you to be that same person before you reached that age to see if there was a change in connecting with this person as a younger person that you recognize as being a child and innocent, et cetera, as opposed to you're less likely to do that at age 15, but we haven't unpacked that empirically yet. So what's the difference of just going through the child scene versus the middle scene versus the last scene versus going through all three? Does the order matter? So those are certainly questions we have that we just need more time to try and unpack.
From listening to friends and also in the literature, when we have these curriculums or workplace trainings to confront racism and discrimination, we have this unintentional, sometimes burden on the people of color in those, where they have to explain racism to their colleagues or disclose experiences that they don't necessarily want to disclose. So when you use the virtual reality training, were you able to measure that potential positive impact with the people of color whose colleagues were in those simulations?
So we haven't measured it yet, but people consistently say it, that, well, thank you, now I don't have to unpack my stuff, my pain and my trauma for other people. So it definitely seems to be something that Black people appreciate. There are things they don't appreciate about this. I think that's a separate conversation about how Black people have responded to this piece. But that is one consistent thing, that you remove this storytelling of what I have to unpack. And I found that even sometimes they're even more willing to share because they feel like it's going to land in a different landscape now, it's landing in a different context than just my story. So that, yeah, we haven't measured it though. What's the question?
Good. First, thank you for your work in the conference today. My question is actually going back to the age thing. So I was wondering if you can talk more about the sample for the study that looked at putting in subtle racist blog posts. I think you said the
18 to 25. 18
to 25. Can you say more about the rationale for that age group?
Yeah, it was kind of based on this data around how frequently that particular age group engages with the media and the ways in which we were going to presented. And it also just, it was in my postdoc at the time, so it also became a way to kind of manage the sample in a more feasible way. But certainly thinking about that group as having come from a particular history around media and media engagement. So I was interested in how they would engage or be impacted by it. And certainly I would expect potentially different responses among a much older sample versus a much younger sample. Yeah.
I'm just curious about your wide subsample. How important, I mean, how diverse it was, and then see some variation in terms of, say, Hispanic versus non-Hispanic white. So you only have non-Hispanic white?
So in this sample, we have people who self-identified as white. There's a smaller portion of people who also identified as Hispanic and multiracial, but prioritize white as their self-designation. We also assess in the sample people who think they are perceived as white, even if they don't identify as white.
Any kind of variation that you?
So right now I'm not seeing any variation in that group, although I do think it is different. I think that subgroup of people who identify as things in addition to white is too small for us to pull out in a meaningful way.
I would be interested in Hispanic white.
Yeah, we have a sample from our school that might be bigger, but I still don't think it'll be big enough to actually pull that group out. But it's a very interesting, that's why we asked the question about perception as white. Yeah. There's another question.
Yeah, it was great seeing this application of VR to this, and so social science computing here at UCLA is just now putting together this VR lab or something, and you're actually having a meeting today to talk about what to do with it. So I was interested just in, how to get VR more integrated into the curriculum, or ways that Columbia might have been doing this in creative ways, and if there's lessons to be learned for UCLA as they're starting to figure out ways to integrate it more into the curriculum for students.
Yeah, for sure. I think creating opportunities for multidisciplinary groups to come together and work on projects together and imagine what their content might be. And I would say avoiding using what has already been done as your template, and instead trying to start from a blank slate and have people imagine what they would create. I think there's a whole spectrum of things that might get created in VR that it's not like film, it's not an established history in that way where there's norms and rules. So I think creating a space for creative, multidisciplinary brainstorming to create content both among faculty and students is an interesting way to go. And I think the University of Michigan has this really interesting approach about how they're integrating the consideration of emerging technologies into their curriculum more broadly. Because just as we're thinking about how to use the technologies, we also want to be thoughtful and critical of the technologies and how they're being used and how what we might do might land in a particular community. So really trying to understand the technology itself. So I think a curriculum that kind of bridges those two is important. We actually just started a new minor at the School of Social Work that I helped design, which is called Emerging Technology Society and Emerging Technology Media and Society, which we're trying to help social workers understand the landscape of all of these technologies, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, et cetera, understanding the implications for vulnerable oppressed populations, also think about how they might use it in their work. So trying to bridge this difference, this combination of content creation and application and constructive criticism and understanding the implications for society. I think that combination is probably important. Yeah.
So during the actual experiment, you were collecting data through
in the VR?
Did you happen to collect like physical responses, like maybe like change in blood pressure or like pulse or something?
No, I wanted to, especially based on the other work I had done, but it's not really my area of expertise, and I didn't know how to measure it reliably with as much movement as was happening. I've since talked to some physicians who have made some recommendations about how they track ambulatory heart function, cardiovascular functioning, and so I may try to integrate some of that later, but I think that's actually a really important and interesting element to integrate.
Like how the body responds, and if they, I guess that's, showing whether or not they recognize these races happen versus like the structure that you kind of set up for them.
Yeah, yeah. And even in the media-based study that I talked about, there's this difference between what's registering physiologically and then what people said to us at the end of the study. It's even Black people would say, that's not a big deal, you know, no sweat, I'm not worried about that. But physiologically, they might something else might be registering. And so the physiological indicators, I think, are really important in terms of giving us a fuller picture of how people are reacting, what they're seeing, what they're reacting to, et cetera.
Thanks for this talk. It's so interesting and cool and important. I guess my question was, I think you had mentioned that the VR has a kind of treatment and control element to it. Is that based on the questions that you asked them, or was the video, was it a different thing that they saw?
So in the first study, it's just the control is not doing VR as a treatment. So a pure control in that sense. We let them do VR after they finish their measures, because people are pretty bummed when they show up to do a virtual reality study and you don't let them do virtual reality. In a second study, we have them engage with it in different ways. So they look at the video of it on the screen versus reading the transcript of it. So there's kind of a few different ways we try to create controls in the VR studies, but sort of more traditional elements of perspective taking, like imagining yourself as this person, imagining you're Michael, and reading the script as opposed to watching it on the screen versus actually going through. We're trying to compare the effects of some of those different ways of interacting with it.
Okay, great.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. And my question is somewhat related to Taylor's question earlier. So I focus a lot on chronic stress and coping, and I know you said that like stress in particular isn't necessarily your focus, but I'm wondering, do you have plans or potentially interested in looking at how people cope with these particular situations?
Yeah, so in the media study, we had a second study where we had a Black sample and actually asked them to focus on what they've just seen in 3 different ways. So we had them ruminate and think about their negative emotions. We had them sort of imagine doing something or acting in response to it. So we were interested in trying to control the ways people were coping or making meaning out of it. We haven't analyzed that data yet, so I don't know what's happening, but I think it's the ways in which people make meaning out of what they've just seen, is really important. So that was our way of trying to try and get a sense of what's the effects of focusing on the negative emotions versus planning and problem solving. And when I first went into that study, my expectation, I think, based on my personality, was problem solving will be good, but they can also be really overwhelming, and you're trying to solve racism. That may not feel good. That may not feel like effective adaptive coping. And so I'm not sure what we'll see in that data.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick suggestion for the physiological measurements. My colleague did virtual reality for simulation for resuscitation in the emergency department, and they did salivary cortisol and heart rate. So I don't know if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I'm curious more about the data science study, to hear a little bit more about that. And you kind of alluded that you found it basically impossible to measure racism in the news articles you pulled out, but what sorts of things you tried or what that experience looked like.
Yeah, so I went in naively, I'm gonna measure all the forms, and I'm gonna capture like how chronic this is. And, of course, realize you need to be much more focused in terms of what you can actually assess, because even trying to assess police violence became a really complicated thing. What does that mean? What are all the words that are synonymous with what it is that you're trying to capture? What might you capture that you didn't mean to capture because of language? And then using these language processing models to try and assess that became really complicated. But police violence felt like something that was narrow enough for us to grapple with. And then we were able to kind of, what we did originally was focus on these 4 leading national news sources like the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, and tracking coverage across those sources over a period of time. Problematic that the people that we're trying to assess these effects in most may not be reading the New York Times in quite at the same rate. They may be engaging with media, even if it is a New York Times article, they may be coming to that article in very different pathways than going to the New York Times site. So what we're trying to do is trying to capture this national sense of how much we're generally talking about it, as an exposure, but we're not able to assess where are people actually getting their news, how much news are they actually consuming, which sources are they consuming more than others. That becomes a whole nother problem. And so then there's also a challenge of, so I think this exposure through media is consistent with this notion of cultural racism, right? It's not happening directly to you, it's vicarious, it's language, it's symbols, it's imagery, it's patterns across multiple pieces of information. But I don't know if I can meaningfully link that to changes in health, right? I have this spike that happened in 2014 that kind of stays elevated. It's not like it was one event. It's not like it was Trayvon and done, right? It was Trayvon, that was not police violence, but that was a catalyst for Black Lives Matter. We started covering and talking about whether the events were actually happening more. We definitely started talking about them more from Trayvon on. So I don't have a clear pre-post. It's not like the event ended, which is where we are in trying to say that, did that meaningfully relate to like shifts in anxiety among Black people at the national level? So then we started thinking about the social media data and whether stress responses are coming up around events in more meaningful ways in terms of networks on Twitter, which are not racialized. You can't, there is Black Twitter, but you don't know if it's just Black people and who are talking in that cluster. So it's very exploratory. But for me, it was an interesting undertaking to try and assess how often is this sort of thing coming up. So right now with the social media data, we're bridging Twitter data around the death of Trayvon, the trial of Mark Zimmerman, the non-acquittal, the death of Mike Brown, the non-acquittal, death of Eric Garner, the non-acquittal, which become these like markers of spikes. And so if in the social media data we see that there's spikes around those particular moments, are there ways that we can reliably think about shifts in health or stress responses around those? But it's quite tricky, quite complicated. If anyone wants to help with this, let me know. But it's, for me, it's exploratory and trying to figure out if there's a meaningful way. And really, I think that's the message of the work that I tried to present today, right? I have a more traditional line of work that uses secondary data, but I'm also trying to push this literature and this work forward to say there are meaningful ways for us to start thinking about what racism is, how it shows up in our lives, and what the implications for health may be. And we can't just be satisfied with modeling racial differences without taking the next step of trying to unpack what that means. Because race is not a point of intervention. Using race as a variable in a model suggests that there's something inherently meaningful about race. You're going to have people not be Black? Or are you going to do something about what comes along with that? And so we have to measure and understand that better in order to produce opportunities for us to actually do something about it. Or else be satisfied that we'll keep describing differences instead of actually doing anything about health inequities by race.
Are you hoping to look into the blatant versus subtle racist messaging in those articles about police brutality?
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots to unpack in terms of like the sentiment and how it's being covered in different types of news sources. But interestingly, the national media is very left-leaning, and there's not a lot of variation, sort of at a surface level in terms of how they unpack it. So we're trying to figure out what are the more nuanced ways that those types of events are being represented. And also I'm interested in this very broad scope, so not just the violence itself, but the political reactions to it. And while maybe that inherently looks like a positive thing, Black solidarity, global solidarity between Blacks in the U.S. and Syria, and maybe that feels good on someone, but you're still responding to this negative thing. And so even within those positive moments, then it still comes in the context of this broader. So even does Black Lives Matter news register differently than the cover of the death, or is it just as harmful? Yeah.
So I had a question about, you had a slide that was like a heat map of like
Cities.
different cities. And so I was interested because I saw Los Angeles was the highest, and I don't know if that's just based on population.
Oh yeah, California is, yeah.
That's how they skew the numbers, but I was interested because there are a number of cities where there was actually a police involved murder. And I'm just wondering why LA, or why you think LA might be higher? Is it just like population wise, or is there something else happening?
I don't know, because so the data science students who were working with me, it wasn't clear. So I put this in, but I'm not clear what the time frame is for this. And so I don't know if it's a particular year, or so I just put it in as to represent how we can assess differences by city. So it could be just the time frame that they used for this. But yeah, you would expect, and we did it by state as well. New York is still not the highest. And Missouri, right, you might expect. But yeah, it's not playing out in terms of frequency in the way that I think it would. Which also makes an interesting argument around proximity, and you can be more distal and still be deeply affected and engaged and impacted, even if you aren't proximal to the actual violence.
But, you know, as you guys were saying, I mean, there clearly are very big differences in the numbers of people in those places. And there may be very big differences.
Just the size of the population.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
But like
Very big
DC,
differences.
in Chicago.
Right. But DC are, the population's much smaller, right? Than
Right,
Los
so-
Angeles. New York would.
Right,
be-
exactly, and that's why,
Yeah.
that's why I was,
That doesn't-
that's why it's interesting that it would be so high. compared
Right,
to
but it's just
Chicago.
numbers. I mean, if you could produce that result, except for New York, with just population size, right?
Which is what?
Population size.
But
So-
there's surprising data on hate crimes recently, and it's shocking to see how the quote-unquote most liberal areas, most liberal schools, actually the rates are actually higher.
I completely agree. Don't get me wrong. I think there may be.
You're saying the
something
absolute
around
number
it.
of number of
I'm just
people
saying
engaged.
You've got number there on the left.
Right.
And that's purely, I mean, Los Angeles just happens to have a much larger population
Right.
than any of those other places. That's all I'm saying.
And Atlanta has a much larger population than
Yeah.
Washington DC.
Right, but it's not.
Yeah, I think it assumes that only people in those places talk about, so this is right, social
Yeah.
media was.
This is Twitter data, yeah.
Right, yeah, so it's not just people in LA talking about LA. Chicago, for example, people love to talk about Chicago. Regardless of its population size. So I think especially given like the events, like you show those spikes and things in the other half, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, because those events are taking place in different places.
In different places, yeah. Yeah.
So regardless of the population size, how much, like, are we talking about these things? Which makes me think, so can you say more about how you distinguish national media versus social media? And, because they could probably overlap, because you started to talk a little bit about how people come to
The
national
media sources, yeah.
sources.
Yeah. So it's just sort of the source where we got the data. So the national media data came from national media websites. We scraped the New York Times website, we scraped the Washington Post. Not me, I don't know how to do that. We claim that. So getting it directly from the website as opposed to retweets, the sharing of news, responses to the news that occur on social media. So the social media data might include the media source. It also includes the responses to it, feelings about it, etc. Are we out of time? Yeah, sure.
This is kind of more of like a framework question, but I'm just curious, like in public health, like we talk about racism, often it's very much at the individual level, and there's definitely been a push to talk about structural racism, but I think when you think about cultural racism and structural racism, there's kind of like, I've seen it portrayed two ways, where like you have structural racism and like cultural racism sits underneath it, but then other ways where like cultural racism and structural racism are like directly influencing and working on one another and supporting one another, and so I'm just wondering how you think about that when you think about your work.
I think it's both. So it depends on sort of what element of culture I think you're pulling out. So the ways in which I'm trying to frame culture at the broad level here, I think would be parallel to structural, but then some of those specific processes that I'm kind of pulling out and categorizing undergird structural systems and policies. So I think it's actually both. Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah. Okay.
I'm actually very interested in the theory that you're developing, and I was just hoping you could talk more about it because it seems like it's going against the grain, perhaps simply by explicating things that are not typically explicated in terms of racialized culture within our fields.
The cultural racism?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wouldn't elevate it to theory just.
No, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like very like, this is not a framework. I tried to claim that at first. I'm like, I'm not even close to like ready to say that. Yeah, but I'm trying to kind of do a couple of things. One, pull from our own discourse in public population health around cultural processes, the way we reference these things, identify that we don't actually ever really unpack what those things are and what they mean, even in the same breath of saying that they're critical and of importance, and then trying to categorize work that's already consistently measuring cultural processes, even if they didn't name it as such. So for instance, studies that are looking at aggregated bias as measured with Google data online, and they're trying to assess geographical blocks of expressing this negative racial sentiment, like using the N-word, I would argue falls under a cultural system, but they don't frame it like that in their paper. And so what I try to do to kind of get around making claims about having a theoretical framework is to say, we're already talking about this, and we're already doing it in the empirical literature in some ways. We're just not framing it as that. And what are the values of explicitly integrating and framing this word collectively as being cultural in nature? And when we do that, we've actually made more progress than we would think around what measuring culture might mean and what that looks like. And then in the same breath, trying to say, there's so much more we could be thinking about and doing, drawing from this existing discourse and narrative. So that I try to leave it a little bit loosey-goosey in the terms as far as frameworks go. But that's the, and then using the particular framework from Hall and Lamont, which wasn't grounded in race at all, but was forwarding a very specific framework around cultural systems and how they should be categorized and thought about, and try to use that to help ground me in terms of how we should be organizing and thinking about these, while also acknowledging that it's a limited framework that didn't have racism in mind when it was being developed, and what else might we be thinking about and considering. So it's a starting point to kind of encourage a conversation more than offer a theory.
Thank you.